much for having me. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to my next couple of days with all of you. As we all sort of work in our studios and are always looking for a new way and a new sort of ideas of how to approach things, I've been really thinking about my artist talk a lot, and so tonight I'm going to do something different that I'm trying to sort of refigure and move it into a new space. And I'm going to give you two talks. The first one I'm going to read to you, and it's going to be images of my work. And then the second one, I'm actually going to give a talk on George Ohr, who is an incredibly influential artist in sort of my trajectory. And I prepared this talk to give at the Perez Miami Art Museum this winter when my show was up. And afterwards, the two curators who I'd worked with for over 4 years, getting ready for the show, basically said to me, we learned more about your work in that one talk than we did in the whole time that we were together, working together in your studio. So I just want to present that in sort of this way of just sort of understanding how everything we look at and everything we understand in this world sort of comes out in what we make. So I'm very bad technically, so we've been working on this. I'm going to try and remember this. Okay. All right. I've always been somewhat obsessed with cooperatives, communal living, and mystical, intentional communities. I'm a child of the 70s and Little House on the Prairie. I'm in love with the political, social, and spiritual embodiments of community. Over the years, I have seen and learned about much work made about utopian ideals, which has been intriguing to me, but it always somehow fell short in some way or was missing something. I was intrigued as to why I was not more in love with all of this work. So seeking this knowledge a few years ago, I began some intensive research into utopia. I originally started by looking at many of the communes from the late 60s, and then continued to drift back to the Nearings and the turn of the century to the Shakers, the Anthroposophists, the Transcendentalists, and the uprising of socialism. Each of these different groups or structures provided a system to organize society so that all human effort and existence mattered, all labor needed to make all work. I learned about function, equality, and use value. During this time, I was lucky enough to come across a book entitled Modern Utopian by Richard Fairfield. It's a collection of essays and articles documenting many communities from the 60s and 70s in a very journalistic and honest manner. He writes about how each group functions, why they have come together, and how they are surviving. One of the most interesting things to me then, as well as now, is that the communities that sustained developed a craft of some sort, that they either made pots, wove, sold vegetables, honey, whatever they could. I somehow had a very hard time grasping this idea, or maybe making sense of it. Was this a success or a failure? They chose to leave a decided culture and set up their own, but they are still tied to it for sustenance. Were they dependent? Were they just using mainstream culture? These ideas are my conceptual guiding forces, function in a sort of murky, unknown space, a space between something. Both are very much based in use in the history of clay. Clay, to me, has always represented a space that exists between 2 and 3 dimensions. It is as if it floats between the wall and the floor, that odd, uncomfortable space when one tries to put the sofa up against the wall. The light sockets, the baseboard, everything does not allow for it to fit. It's uncomfortable. It's unknown. It is a freedom. It has allowed me to form my notions of Baroque minimalism or my reckless grace. Process-wise, the material has you constantly moving between form and surface. You build with it first sculpturally, then you fire it and have to approach surface, a direct conversation with painting. It historically fits into a place between the never-ending conversation of art and craft. And conceptually, it is, to me, fertile and somewhat all-encompassing, allowing to further conversation in many realms and many chosen subjects throughout the year. Function is a concept which is inherently tied to the material as well. Clay is part of our everyday existence through use and structure. We eat on it, we live in buildings made of it, we go to the bathroom on it. I had always known this, but it somehow became clearer with my research on the communes. This is why I was so interested in them. I'm not so intrigued with utopian ideals. I find them beautiful and seek them in everyday life. But it was not what kept bringing me back to them. It was how they worked. It is the system in which a group of people can be self-sufficient and successful. It is a place where one is aware of equality and the importance of each and every action. I discuss it as non-hierarchical space, one that is level no matter what the meaning, where each and every part is on the same plane, a place or space where all parts, middle, background, foreground, object, subject, support, and surface, function in the same realm and are the same value. I am constantly attempting to create this in my work through materials and juxtapositions. I have sought to use each material for its inherent value, be it form, color, surface, or structure. Each material has properties that are unique. They become entities which seek to coexist through their use and strength. Colors and surfaces in paint could not be achieved through glaze and vice versa. Clay and glaze are separated and seen as individual, denying ceramic objectness. Weight is balanced through use of bronze, wood, and clay. I am attempting to form a cohesive whole through each segment and moment. This awkward and uneasy space of equality in our culture has fueled much discussion. It is held in my all-encompassing discussion of feminism, the decorative, adornment, restitutions, and even recently in an exhibition based on an essay by Rudolf Steiner on bees. He beautifully discusses the hive with a pseudo-scientific investigation of love. He discusses the importance of the role of each bee within and then their immense impact on the world around them through this love, or science of love. The hexagon and other polygons have somehow found their way into my vocabulary for this investigation, but even more through a connection of all of the above. They provide a shape or form that is open, connective, almost in opposition to the square or rectangle. Your eye wants to have it grow or continue the pattern. There is movement. It is both Baroque and minimal, excess and single. It references function. It is a conversation enlightened by, but outside of, the known trajectory. Number 2. When I was thinking about this talk, I decided to read everything I could get my hands on about Ohr. I read a lovely short story of which he starred in, written at the turn of the century, and many of the numerous books which have been written in the past few years. I learned much about him, much of what I will share. One of the most telling things, though, came from a conversation with my 9-year-old son over lunch about a few weeks ago. I asked him if he always knew of Ohr and what he thought of him. His response was, "Of course I know of Ohr. You and Dad talk about him at least once a week at dinner. I know his work well. When I was little, I thought he was a past president, not an artist." This somehow fits in perfectly with my thoughts to be explained, that Ohr is, in many ways, within the patrimony of American art. He was a founding force in what truly rethought and restructured a Eurocentric art making. I've always loved Ohr. I've always been inspired by him, sought to understand him. However, I have always done that as an artist and not as an academic. I cannot speak to you all from a position of known authority as an academic on Ohr could. While working on this, I questioned deeply what authority is and how that can exist in my life, in my making. The only thing I can claim any sort of authority to is my work and my parenting. Not my children for sure, but what I do with them. Of course, Ohr knew this way ahead of me. One of the first and most telling things I ever learned about him was that he called all of his pieces of clay his clay babies, and all of his 10 children his live potteries. He united art and technical labor fully into everyday life. He had no division of life and making. His conceptual concerns engulfed every part of his existence. He is the ideal form of social practice in so many ways. First, let's get a time frame and some understanding of his life. George Ohr was born in Biloxi on July 12, 1857. His father established the first blacksmith shop in Biloxi. George worked in his studio for a bit and then drifted to other part-time jobs. He was first introduced to clay at 19. In 1879, he was offered an apprenticeship to Joseph Fortune Meyer's pottery studio. In 1881, Ohr jumps on a freight train and tours through 16 states, visiting as many potters and studios as he can. One of major influence was the brothers Kirkpatrick in Illinois. In 1882, he starts working at the William Virgin Pottery in New Orleans, eventually becoming Newcomb Pottery. A year later, in 1883, George goes back to Biloxi and builds his first studio with his savings of $26.80. George marries Josephine Geary, September 15, 1886. His first child, Ella Louise, is born in 1887. She dies a few months later. In the next 13 years, they would have 9 more children, a few of whom did not live past childhood. Ohr begins referring to himself as an art potter in 1891. In 1894, a devastating fire destroys Ohr's studio. At the same time, he begins to get public attention in newspapers. A year later, Ohr built a small home in a five-story pink pagoda pottery and names it Biloxi Art Pottery Unlimited. In 1899, unprompted, Ohr sends 8 pieces to the Smithsonian. These were chipped and broken due to improper handling. They were accessioned 87 years later. By 1901, Ohr begins to investigate pure clay form and is not as intrigued by glaze. In 1903, he stops using glaze entirely to focus on more sculptural works. In 1904, Ohr won a silver medal at the Louisiana Purchase International Exhibition in St. Louis. I recently saw these pieces. They were 3 stunning 3-inch tall works. In 1905, Ohr's mother dies and wills land to Josephine and his surviving siblings. A year later, in 1906, dispute over family land begins. In 1909, George begins to give up making work. He is also faced with a lunacy hearing due to anger over family land dispute with his siblings. He was ruled sane on April 3rd. He had many appearances in the newspapers, reports of numerous arrests, as well as eloquent letters written in the protest of the state of the prisons and treatment of citizens. In 1910, he made his last pot. Sons convert his studio into the Ohr Boys Auto Repairing Shop. On Sunday, April 7, 1918, at 3:10 a.m., George E. Ohr died of throat cancer at the age of 60. He left about 7,000 mud babies stored in open crates in his attic. They remained there until 1968, when James W. Carpenter, an antiques dealer from Montague, New Jersey, arrived in Biloxi to search for his specialty, old cars, preferably a Cadillac or Model T. At the auto repair shop owned by Ohr's sons, they showed him the crates and he wanted to purchase all of the pots. 2 years later, they agreed, and they were all sold for about $50,000. Ohr believed all of his work was a whole and thought it all should exist as one piece, not many pots. In many ways, the sale was ideal to his thinking, but sadly, this definitely did not hold. In 1972, Mr. Carpenter began to sell the pieces individually from $40 to $1,200. About 500 of Ohr's bisque pieces were presumed to be unfinished and glazed by dealers, which naturally ruined them. The pots pale in comparison, of course, to Ohr's glazing techniques. There are numerous stories that continue after this to give rise to Ohr. There's, of course, Jasper John's paintings. He did a whole show at Castelli that was based off an Ohr pot he had collected. Rauschenberg, Warhol, Gehry, and many others were inspired. His work became known and shown at numerous museums. His first major show in 1989 in New York at the American Craft Museum. His work was finally accessioned into the Smithsonian. He became a reference point for much conversation on craft and art, and now there's finally a museum dedicated to him. What I crystallized from all this research and intense focus is that I love his pots. They are amazing, truly. I could just sit here and point and say, look at this one, it's fabulous. I've spent days over the past 24 years doing this. They are pure visual pleasure. Very small, these 4 by 8 inch pots are masterful sculpture. They can hold a room on their own, each one bringing so much information and joy to the viewer. The color is rough and unpleasant and gorgeous. The form is fluid and awkward. They are harmonizing beauty. Words which have been used to describe them: decadent, misshapen, leprotic, intestinal, bloody, erotic, beautiful, opulent, humorous, rough, etheric, challenging, wacky. They possess a clear interior and exterior. They are complete. I've begun to truly understand that for me, it is these miraculous pots, in connection with all of his other work that you are looking at above, which I have learned so much from. It is his multidisciplinary and avant-garde approach to all materials and processes he came into contact with. His work involves form, color, poetry, semiotics, performance, collage, architecture, community, and early use of media. He seamlessly embodies all of it. All form parts of a single whole. It can be seen as a single flowing line. I spend a lot of time thinking about clay. What is clay? What is ceramics? And both clay and glaze as materials. I've attempted to separate them in my work and use them for their inherent value. It is beautiful to see how Ohr did this through the trajectory of his career. He began with making functional objects, then moved on to trinkets and tourist pieces. Although he never abandoned these, maybe financially, but I also think he had a lot of fun making them. He then moved on to his pots. His early pieces are more based in recognizable form, Greek and Roman vessels, high Baroque, and are not so intensely glazed. As he moved deeper into his investigations, the forms became less symmetrical, the glaze more intricate and experimental. I can say from working with the pot that breaking symmetry is not easy, and maybe even harder on the wheel, which sort of dictates it. There's something about the pot shape that is in our DNA, the elegance and dignity of form. We have a bodily relationship with it. It is real work to attempt to manipulate and challenge the silhouette while maintaining grace and energy and not being somewhat obvious. Ohr did this brilliantly. Then, after about 25 years of making, he starts to abandon glaze. He uses clay as pure form, not a relationship of surface and form. The early pieces from this time have some glaze, lines or drips of it. The later work, he begins to use 2 different types and colors of clay that act as the surface for information. By doing this, he actually transforms the idea of ceramics. It's not an object anymore. It cannot be fetishized as a pot or function. It is truly sculpture, existing in 6 inches of clay. It is a major departure in his work, and actually in the conversation of craft and art. He takes a craft material, embodies it with the concepts of utility, and makes pure art. He deeply understood performance and used it in so many ways. When working with clay, I have learned that it's a constant moment of awareness, almost a performance-like relationship. It is of now, this moment, not of next Tuesday. It's an incredibly time-based, not to sound cheesy, but it's somewhat of a dance between maker and material. It records everything, every mark, every movement. There are rules which cannot be broken to get through the process, but it works best when these are challenged and twisted. He understood this presence, as one can see in the vitality of the wares, but he also discussed it in many other ways. He designed a portable kiln that he would take with him to shows and fairs. He traveled with his wheel and put on a show of sorts with his throwing, which was masterful. I quote Ohr, "This is what I do with a ball of clay on the wheel. Blindfolded, turn a jug, put a corn stopper in it, change the corn cob into a funnel, have the funnel disappear, and have a jar. Change the jar into an urn and half a dozen other shapes. and turn anything that anyone in the USA can mention that is cylindrical on the potter's wheel. Along with this, he appeared in costume on numerous occasions as ongoing performances and happenings. A favorite of mine is Ohr as Father Time. He used the camera and staged images of his work, of him, of his house, of his family, of his studio. He used language brilliantly. He created his own unique phonetic and text-like language. It was not easy for the viewer. It needed time and thought to be deciphered or read. And some of the most powerful work to me is the advertisements, editorials, statements, conversations, and just pieces of art that he had printed in local publications and newspapers. At times, they embodied this Ohr-like speech. At other times, they were eloquent and cleanly written, all dependent on what he was trying to do. When I was thinking about them and looking at them, I can float to that all-famous and inspirational art forum ad of Linda Benglis in 1972. They both sharply use the media for deep political purpose. Political practice is something that I saw in Ohr's work, but I never really knew about some of the influences or causes promoted. I didn't know why I never put it together, but of course, it was the turn of the century, one of my favorite times for much of its political, social, and spiritual embodiments. It was a time of deep spiritual crisis from the Industrial Revolution. It was the time of the Shakers, the Anthroposophists, the Transcendentalists, Emerson, and the arts and crafts movement. All this became part of Ohr's conversation. Socialism was a way to organize society so that all human effort and existence mattered. It held value of and in manual labor. People sought a fair and balanced life, equality. He was a supporter and sympathizer of the movement. There is no proof that he ever joined. However, he took the cause deep into his life through his practice. There was a local socialist paper, Appeal to Reason, which Ohr promised a monthly 12-inch vase, which of course would be one of a kind, which would go to the member who collected the greatest amount of subscribers. He would inscribe it, presented to, by the Appeal to Reason, for the meritorious service in the cause for socialism. There was a cooperative colony formed in 1890 in the Gulf Coast, which was called Cooppolis Clay. It was made up of mostly populists and supporters of collectives, farmers, and workers. They became self-sufficient as a community. Ohr did not join, but endorsed the clay and products made. All of this he took political action in, but probably the most socialist act of Ohr's was the conceptual value of function, which was embodied in all of his work. His materials used, clay, media, and photography, had the base idea of from and for the people. He took this on with vigor. All of this comes back to a fullness of practice, this ability to take whatever is needed to complete a conceptual concern, to study something fully and completely, from digging and hauling his clay from a local riverbank, to spending hours and hours working on a wheel, to experimenting with new media when he saw fit. That engrossment allowed for a space to discuss something new, understand something more about the world in which we exist, the community around us. He translated his knowledge of a material into a radical and political framework. Ohr was a revolutionary and continues to be. His work is about clay, about earth, about humanity, about being. It is beautiful, grotesque, abject, and present. It hides nothing or any part of the process. It is truly visceral in a way that we do not really see again until Pollock. He fully and completely embraced and created a language of abstraction. His omnipresent idea that a utilitarian object could embody meaning beyond its purpose, we see again 20 years later from Duchamp. He was interested in the notion of the banal and how it could be invested with conceptual and philosophical significance, much like minimalism. He used language on form, which connects to 70s conceptual art. We can also see the folded forms of another one of my true heroes, Hannah Wilke. He manipulated and restructured words in newspapers, signs, and in live performances. He created a postmodern persona. Ohr's work is about the other, being exposed to the elements and somehow surviving, attempting to control the earth around us, or maybe better, making conversation of what is around us and asking for change. He is the educated and eloquent common laborer, This relates to me to the American vernacular and is deeply reflected in the arts movements of the United States for the past century, a strange crossbreed of craft and art. To quote a critic of his time, one of his only supporters, Ohr's creations defy revered ideas of nature and represent deeper messages about the human condition, perpetual struggle with life's meaning, and modern perceptions of individual value. I think I can say that he is the inheritance of American art. He is a history. He understood and made a signifier of a new conversation, something I hope we are all seeking in our daily work. To end with a quote by Ohr, the mystic, from 1898, I am making pottery for art's sake, God's sake, and the future generation, and by present indications for my own satisfaction. But when I am gone, my work will be prized, honored, and cherished. Thank you all so much for your time.